Welcome to the Yale Center for British Arts online series At Home Book Discussion. I am Emily Evans Eerdmans, a design historian and founder of Eerdmans New York, a fine and decorative arts gallery and consultancy in New York City. I am absolutely delighted to welcome the renowned landscape architect and historian Todd Longstaffe-Gowan to our program today. We will be discussing his new book, which you all must own, English Garden Eccentrics. Before we begin, I have a few housekeeping notes. Please note that this program will be recorded. Your camera and sound are muted and will remain so throughout the program. We will be using the Q&A feature located on your navigation bar to gather your questions for Todd, and they will be answered at the end of the program. But please feel free to submit your questions at any time. If you would like closed captioning, a live transcript is available by clicking the icon on your navigation bar. Yale University acknowledges that Indigenous people and nations, including Mohegan, Mashantucket Pequot, Eastern Pequot, Schaghticoke, Golden Hill, Pocasset, Neantic, and the Quinnipiac and other Algonquin-speaking people have stewarded through generations the lands and waterways of what is now the state of Connecticut. We honor and respect the enduring relationship that exists between these people and nations and this land. Todd Longstaffe-Gowan is a landscape architect and historian with an international practice based in London. He is Gardens Advisor to Historic Royal Palaces, trustee of the Chelsea Psychic Garden, lecturer at New York University in London, president of the London Gardens Trust, editor of The London Gardener, and author of several books, including The London Town Garden and The London Square, both published by Yale University Press. He recently designed a new garden for the Morgan Library and Museum in New York, which he describes as a whiff of Rome in Midtown Manhattan. Other projects include the Waterside Garden of the Murrow Gallery in London, Magellus Garden at the Venice Architectural Biennale in 2021, the Kitchen Garden at Kew Palace, the Privy Garden at Hampton Court Palace, and the gardens at the Royal College of Art in London. Todd, I'm exhausted. That's such incredible.
Such a litany. I just want to correct one thing, which you said. You just said it was the Chelsea Psychic Garden. That makes it sound rather too interesting. It's the Physic Garden.
Physic Garden, yes. So correct me in all times.
Fine. It sounds fascinating.
So this, your book, English Garden Eccentrics, is essentially a book of 21 biographies of 21 different personalities. And the first line of the book, which is actually a quote, is, "In this age, the mere example of nonconformity, the mere refusal to bend the knee to custom is itself a service." And you speak a bit about the importance of eccentricity. And of course, the idea of doing a biography of eccentrics came from Edith Sitwell's famous book. Why is this so important? And why were you inspired by Edith Sitwell?
I suppose I first read Edith Sitwell when I was a teenager. And you can see her on the left here with her rather amazing profile and her enormous cabochons. And I just thought she was a rather extraordinary person, a poet and a writer. And I just found myself inexorably drawn towards her chapter. It was the very first chapter in her book, and it was on ancients and ornamental hermits. I sort of fancied myself in old age, spending my life sort of in a cave or in some wonderful garden, telling people about wonderful things. And this appealed to me immensely. And she goes through these wonderful things about these rather eccentric people. And I realized that when I was thinking about this later, I was fascinated by eccentric people or personalities because they sort of undermine classificatory boundaries. They're people who don't belong to the present, who seem out of joint with their own time. Some of whom are trapped in the past, and some of whom are ahead of their time. And it was also became further apparent to me that I was interested in this by my love of gardening, because I perceived that most of the gardeners I most admired were people who were doing things that were in some ways sort of dangerously excessive, or that gardening induced them a kind of a sort of incipient or playful lunacy. So these are things that sort of attracted me from the very beginning. And I have by nature, I've just always been attracted to rather more curious people.
You talk a bit about eccentricity being sort of compliant with the norms of society versus non-compliant. And so that what some people might call eccentric is really just somebody listening to their own inner voice.
Absolutely. They were creative rather than compliant. They were people who were immensely expressive, felt sufficiently self-confident to actually do their own thing. And this, I think, is absolutely crucial, because you have to believe in yourself and your own personality and your own ability to do things, and just sort of, just disregard what the public has to say. As you said in the original quotation, as you're opening my work that came from John Stuart Mill's On Liberty, and it just says, that we're tyrannized by the majority, and that you really have to express yourself. You have to just ignore everything that's sort of polite and expected of you in ordinary society, and just pursue your own course. And very often that means being reasonably idiosyncratic, and which I heartily approve of.
And I would say a message, a timeless message that is helpful to hear as much today as it was in 1859 when he wrote it. Now, you just said playful incipient lunacy. And in your introduction, there is a photograph. It isn't exactly this photograph, but it's from this garden, which is Lampert Hall. And why do you use this as an example to illustrate sort of the madness of some of your characters?
This fellow here, Sir Charles Isham, was a landowning magnate who pursued a lot of alternative things during his life, but he could have just been an ordinary landowner, but he decided somehow, we're not quite certain how, among his interest in veganism and psychiatric things, and different forms of Christian religion, he decided that somehow he had this rather mystical quality, and he got very interested in, as you can see here, these fairy miners and these very miniature people. And he was, and this is actually, these are inhabitants, these are two images from the late 19th century showing the fairy miners at work, and on the right on strike in his amazing rockery he built on the outside of within view of his bedroom at the back of his house in the Midlands in England. And he built this extraordinary rock, like a giant rockery, a towering confection behind his house. And the aim was to create an environment for these figures whom he believed came to life at night. It's not just, it wasn't just a fantasy, but he believed these figures, these little ceramic figures that are between 1 to 3 inches high, actually had real lives. And and they inhabited this amazing world that he created with bonsais and rocks. And he just strikes me as a rather extraordinary person. And he was the first person to introduce as well what we now know as the garden gnome into Britain in the 19th century. So
a very important contribution to garden.
Important contribution. It's the most tasteful gardens in the realm.
And there is a quote that you have in the book, if you could remind us what it is, about how he believed that after he died, that the soul of the garden would be gone, that it wouldn't endure after him.
He's absolutely right. I believe, anyways. I'm certainly of the opinion that most of these people whom I looked at in the course of my studies were people who were creating gardens is a very dynamic process. They were ongoing processes, never completed. And they were, in fact, a lifetime's work, and they were intended, in fact, to be forms of autobiography. And that's really where I differ from most sort of eccentric biography, is that I'm interested in the gardens as an object, very important way of telling the lives of these people. And I'm interested in these gardens during the course of their own life. After they die, I cease to have an interest because they're taken over by other people. They're not what they were, because also the people who made these gardens were very much part of the compositions. And in some of the places, like this place here, in fact, when you went around, he was part of the scenery. I mean, it was essential for a very accurate, receptive reading to place to actually have him present, because he was so much part of this great creation. And again, so I'm firmly of the belief that these places become rather lifeless artifacts after the death of their creators. And that's why I don't really deal with them afterwards, but there's sufficient during the course of their lives to examine. It really gives us a very good flavor of what they're attempting to do.
And you explore the idea of eccentricity connected to creativity, and creativity being connected to madness, but also passion. There's a lot of passion in your figures. And one is Lady Reed, who we are seeing in her aviary. And her passion made itself known in collecting birds. And so not all of your figures are collectors, but quite a few were collectors.
Yes, I think it's a really important part of these things. I mean, Lady Reed was an exceptional woman who was described in her own time by contemporaries as sort of defiantly individualistic, devoid of any feminine reserve, of delicacy, and sort of almost grotesque in her appearance. And especially in the midst of her animals, she was absolutely fascinated by animals and birds. And we don't have an image of her in her beautiful aviaries, which were quite extensive, but on the left is a near contemporary engraving showing a woman in an aviary. And it's quite interesting. She almost becomes like one of these birds. She's in a gilded cage, which we'll refer to later. But she was absolutely obsessed with, as well, forming an enormous collection of exotic birds. And these were almost all exotic birds. And on the right-hand side of this slide, you can see this is a painting of some cases of birds that were painted by French artists living in London in the early Regency. And he went to one of these famous places, Piccadilly, and painted these cases of birds. And this gives an example of birds that were in her aviaries at the time and considered to be very great trophies. But it was like so many people, she just never stopped collecting. I mean, the only thing that really stopped her was that there was a terrible fire and a lot of the birds were destroyed. And she then was forced out by her family to live in a dower house and came to London and brought with her some of those things. But really, it is one of the great characteristics of the eccentrics I look at, that they just accumulate and with great vivacity and display things in a rather more eccentric and much more energetic way than one would in most cases.
And you look at a lot of these you look into the psychology of a lot of these figures. So, for example, with Lady Reed, you mention how her son died, and after having twins, I believe, and then she became very reclusive, sort of. Separated from her husband, and then just surrounded herself by birds. And it was almost, one could read into it, a result of trauma that she went down this path. And you describe how she was hardly ever seen, but when she traveled, she would travel with all these birds, and people would gather to try to get a glimpse of what was described by a contemporary, her grotesque appearance. And one is like, what does she, what did she look like? And what was it like with this cloud of birds around her? And it's part of the mystique, which is also so fascinating about these characters.
Yes, and I think it's also a very unself-conscious way of expressing herself. She was naturally attracted to birds. She did have a miserable life, it's true. I think she had a beastly husband. And her family weren't that kind to her. And she just retreated to her aviaries, where she could console herself amongst these very, very exotically plumed birds. And I think it was a really wonderful avian fancy, and it really enriched her life to no end. And these were her children, as it were. They sort of supplanted all those rather ghastly people that she had to live with on an ordinary basis. So it's, yes, and I think that the idea again of this unself-conscious display is so important, because I think that it's almost all these people in their lifetimes would have been appalled to be considered eccentric. It wasn't a term of endearment. Now we kind of use it in a very light way to say, oh, isn't she or he eccentric? And thinking, isn't that a nice and charming way of describing somebody who might be rather interesting? But it was certainly not considered to be the case at the time when most of the people I'm writing about were being described. It was less than wonderful. So the idea that they willfully express themselves like this was contrary to all the fashions of the time. So it really did take a striking degree of individuality to feel that you were, morally strong enough, as it were, to go out and face the world and do what you wanted to do. Especially as some of these people like her, who was, born to great wealth and privilege. This was a slap in the face to all these people. They considered to be rather odd, as it were. for choosing to live in this manner.
Right. And she's rejecting the way that her peers are living. So it is, I could see how others would be offended by that rejection of the norm.
Yes.
And another figure who also, in a way, created her own world through her collecting of botanical specimens was Lady Dorothy Nevill. And you write about how there was some sort of major scandal after she was a debutante, but that rehabilitated her reputation a little bit after marrying, but sort of went her own way also by just going wild with collecting all these specimens and forming friendships with Charles Darwin, for example.
She was a rather amazing woman because she was a society woman who could have very easily just lived her life in the great drawing rooms of the kingdom. And she was very intelligent, very well-spoken, very amusing, elfin-like in her physique. And she was, but she decided that she wanted to do something much more individualistic, and she was sort of torn about various aspects of directions as to which direction she should go. But she decided that she was very, very keen, especially on plants, and she kept no fewer in her place called Dankstein after she married her husband that gave her this respectability she needed. She felt she could all of a sudden unleash upon the world her great collections of plants, and she had 14 houses, peach cases, vineries for aquatics and filmy fern houses and things. But her great obsession was orchids. And I show one here on the side, on the left-hand side, it's called a Masdevallia chimera, and a rather exotic orchid. And it was the orchids that really attracted people like Darwin and others to her. But it was very indelicate and very unfeminine at the time to really like these sort of highly sexualized plants. And she was certainly in minority, and certainly in her class, a very unusual bird, because she really liked these plants that most people would have called monstrosities of nature, or sort of the offsprings of unnatural adulteries. So they were barbarically colored, they're plants with strange barbaric names, they're carnivorous plants, they came from all of these exotic places, and they were really morbid horrors of vegetation, chosen not for their beauty, but for their strangeness. And I think this really was a very, very bizarre way of collecting. So this really made her, she was doing this again as a private pursuit. She's not doing this to impress anybody, but she's just having a really jolly good time. I think she was very keen to become friends with Darwin. I think that he mentions that, she wrote incessantly, as it were, to him and to others at the time who were eminent botanists, trying to sort of, and I think she grew these plants for them, hoping that they would actually come to her gardens to see them growing, because she was a bit of a junkie also for these celebrity botanists.
And Virginia, one of the things I love about your different biographies is that you include how contemporaries viewed these people and their collections or their gardens, whether it's flattering or not flattering. And you describe how Virginia Woolf knew Lady Dorothy and described her as, for somebody who is sort of upper class, as Lady Dorothy would say, was not so bad, that she was sort of a gilded bird, but one that could sort of come out of the cage occasionally.
Absolutely.
And something that you write, which really resonated, was in refusing to acknowledge established boundaries between serious intellectual enterprise and aristocratic play. She was, like so many eccentrics, content to move between world and to belong wholly to none. And that there's that comfort level of following their own path.
That's so true. And I think she was a very good example of that. As you said, that Woolf compared it a little, she said that she was confined to a bird cage rather than an asylum. Like, she's kind of mad, but, and how the door was occasionally left open. She'd fly out and fly back in. And that she was, as you say, torn between these different worlds. So she was constantly going in and out of this cage. And in a way, sort of like our previous exemplar here, she had this sort of curious double life, although I think that Lady Dorothy did spend much more time in the drawing room. What's so strange about her too is that, having carried out these really audacious flights of reckless whimsicality, she sort of decides one day just to sell up everything and just move to a new house and start over. And it's kind of a wonderful thing, but rather curious, having spent such a long time cultivating these very freakish plants, to all of a sudden move to a villa on the south coast and just take up growing citrus fruits and stuff like that. Citrus, it's this very curious thing, but there we go.
That there wasn't such an emotional attachment, which it was.
No, exactly.
So many of the other
she just moved on to her next collection. She was very happy to do that.
Yeah, that was.
Her husband had died, and very often with these women, of whom I deal with quite a few, there were very traumatic circumstances that really encouraged them to take up gardening in a very significant way. And I think that, whether it's a loss of a husband or because you're a miserable husband that you don't like, or family problems, the garden became a wonderful solace, and that you would turn to that for various reasons and pursue this with huge energy.
One of the most, maybe one of the most eccentrics is our next guest, is Dr. John Samuel Feeney, with his house in Chelsea, London, which he interestingly helped develop Chelsea, planning several streets and planting rows of London plane trees, which was so interesting to discover.
Yeah, and he was a man who is highly intelligent, rather extraordinary in many, many ways, but he somehow became rather maybe too obsessed with his family origins, which he traced back. He was incredibly, in fact, ferociously proud of them. He traced them back to the Phoenicians through India, Persia, Troy, and Italy. So at some juncture in his life, he inherited quite a lot of money from his brother. He decides that he's going to do something very showy. And largely, there's a big public element to this thing because it's on the road, his house, but you can see on the right-hand side. But he also created this rather forlorn garden, which isn't overgrown on the left-hand side. This is what it was like. It never really got that developed. And so he was so keen in, as it were, developing the facade of his house, which he said represented the struggle between the Greek and the Trojans before Troy. And he assembled this sort of bric-a-brac into making this really, a lot of it was not the best quality materials, but he put it all together in a rather artful and inventive way. And he called it his Italian Renaissance chateau, and saying it was in emulation of a house that the family owned, which I've never been able to trace somewhere in France. But he said that it was the dream of his life to do this, and he was very pleased to do that. He said, though, that it didn't meet very much public approval. In fact, it was called by most people the freak mansion, the quaint mystery house, the gingerbread castle, and sometimes even the spirited but clumsy pastiche of all these things. But he insisted that it really was a really wonderful thing, that the people of London just didn't appreciate good architecture. But here we see him on the left-hand side of his garden, in his garden, with all his statuary. And I presume these were things that just didn't fit onto the facade of his building. And these were arranged in no particular order. And he had a pony and a few other things in his back garden, but it really was terribly overgrown. And it was a place it was a sanctuary of the most inner sort. No one was permitted in here. In fact, there's one little account of some people, passers-by, walking by, seeing the gate open and peeking in. And he says he invites them in just for a few steps. And then after about 5 seconds, he says, "All right, you can go, you've seen it." He forces them out again at the other end. So it really was very private. And the very poignant thing about this is that, having expended so much time and energy and money putting together this great assemblage, after he died, there were no heirs, and the place was sold up. And it's really sad that, when it finally opened to the public, everyone, I think, was expecting this rather extraordinary castle filled with amazing things. Right. It was all, as we say here, all fur, no knickers. And it was really this extraordinary arrangement where, when it opened to the public, they just said it was, having been one of the greatest and long-guarded secrets, this great Chelsea landmark, it was, they said, only a mad lumber room after all. I mean, the mystery flew out, as they say, the mystery flew out of this rubbish heap as soon as the auctioneer turned the key to the front door. So his whole fantasy world that he'd been so obsessed with just dissolved and was reappropriated elsewhere. But an extraordinary record of a rather remarkable and idiosyncratic man.
And so it's so interesting because certain of your figures or characters, as I keep referring to them, some of them had the intention that it would be seen by the public, whereas others, it was so private. But it seems that more actually did want to share it with a wider audience, which is the case with Enston Rock. So this is your first chapter in the book, and it's the earliest. It's in the what is the date of this? This is actually
the 17th century, yeah.
Yeah, the 17th century, 1620s, 30s, that he begins. And it was the king and the queen visited. How was it when you were researching, and gardens are so ephemeral, how was it finding documentation for things, especially something so early as this?
This is a rather better documented than most gardens, early gardens of England. It's pretty, and it's not really well documented. It was such an extraordinary feat, even in its own day, and was seen by Charles I and Henrietta Maria, who made a special visit down to visit this thing called this ingenious artificial delight of the grotto.
And she gave him a mummy.
She gave him a mummy. It was one of two that he possessed, possibly three, we don't know, which he traveled with throughout the course of his life. And they inhabited this wonderful place in Oxfordshire. But he's a curious man too, because he was an energetic entrepreneur, very imaginative, and he did all sorts of things. And he lived a life of great debauchiness. He was keen on natural philosophy, but having realized he just went a little bit too far in his 20s, he decides that he's going to seek redemption for a period of what he calls pensive retirement. And he goes up to Scotland, comes back down again, having spent time in a sort of hermit cell, as another recurring feature throughout the book. And he moves to Oxfordshire and alights upon this wonderful, natural occurring spring, where he decides he's going to make this. And he says he beautified this desolate cell of nature and all its rarities at the head of this spring. And he turns this into this rockwork and things you can see on the left-hand side here. And it was a great series of artificial mechanicals, so huge hydraulic arrangements here. And it was a really astonishing place, because it had, there's a description of the period, and it talks about the artificial thunder, lightning, rain, hail showers, drum beating, organs playing, birds singing, waters murmuring, the dead arising, lights moving, rainbows reflecting with beams of the sun, and watery showers springing up from the same fountain. So it was a great extravaganza, and something that you may have seen on the continent, but certainly in England, there was nothing like it. And that happened within that little building there, that Gothic building within the grotto in the center there. But on the right-hand side, you see one of these little artificial mechanicals, which is the figure of Neptune. And what's interesting is you see this little wheel on the bottom. Well, this was moved with the current of the water, and it moved the series. You can see a duck and a spaniel going in perpetual motion, chasing each other around, never catching up, of course. And this was another one of these great sort of gimmicks that he created in his garden. And again, dealing with these ephemeral qualities of the garden, it actually was largely destroyed and overgrown in the period of his own lifetime, because the Civil War meant that he had to abandon the garden. He returned after many years to find the place really overgrown. He returned with his mummies. And there's a very nice description by Aubrey that talks about how he'd returned after the Civil War to find this place, and it was a ruin. But there's this man who seemed like 300 years old. He's obviously not. It's the builder here, Thomas Bushell, who was sort of dressed as a hermit with these two mummies and lying on a hammock amongst this amazing ruin. So in the course of his lifetime, like we said earlier, the garden had been built and completely turned to ruins. And yet he was very happy with his own creation.
And he sort of did it almost to penury too, didn't he? That he just spent his entire fortune doing it. Like so many people, he just expended all his money and energies to this single project. So Bushell at Enston, just like the creator of the garden we're looking at right now, Lady Broughton at Hoole House, they're creating these man-made very tremendous undertakings out of nature, which is, of course, has its own mind, and that they're crafting an artificial, picturesque version of something that is naturally occurring, but of course there's nothing, especially a tool house, nothing naturally occurring about this sort of miniature alpine garden. Can you first describe what we're looking at, which is
Absolutely. She's one of my favorites, you must be. Lady Broughton, Dame Liza. She again had a unsuccessful marriage, and she was left with sufficient money, and her husband bought her house outside Chester, and it was really, I presume, a pretty boring site, very flat, very dull. And she decides to animate this with great effect, and she sets to work immediately in the around 1810, 1820, to build this remarkable garden. And you can just on the top right see the house itself, which is a very polite villa from the period, and it's the Camellia House at the back here. But what she does was she makes nothing short of this enormous rock room, which is like a cordillera or mountain range, which she called her rock fence, that surrounded this rather polite garden. So she has in the middle, you can just make out these little round, I think 28 of these little round Regency flower beds filled with very colorful flowers of the period, beside which or around which she built this extraordinary series of rock works. And they were capped with spars, so white like frost and snow. They were intended to be a miniature mountain landscape, and planted with plants that were grown in the Alps. And the remarkable thing too is that she did this herself with her gardener. And over the course of 30 years, her gardener, who we know records the fact that he spent all his time building and unbuilding this thing, because she was never satisfied that this was absolutely right. So she kept on and rather energetically reassessing the whole project over and over throughout the course of her entire life. But it was this scene of wild irregularity that was so astonished her contemporaries. And this is, in fact, a clipping from a book by Loudon, John Loudon, the great improver, landscape improver. And he was desperate to record this garden, to say it was one of the most exceptional places he'd ever seen. And we don't know, this is the interesting thing, what inspired her to do this, because there's really nothing like it in Cheshire. Certainly in England at the time, there's nothing. We can only imagine that she may have been reading Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, published in 1818, which talks about this extraordinary landscape. We don't know whether she traveled to the continent, even went to the Alps. This is the inspiration. The next image here is called the Mer de Glace. For those who've been to Chamonix, these rapidly disappearing, sadly, glaciers, was the inspiration for the garden. You can see how closely related it is to it. But what is fascinating is that we know that when she died, she left a cabinet full of models, miniature models of alpine scenery, to her nephew, who was an eminent paleontologist and geologist. And we suspect that those were actually models for this garden. And so it's really interesting that to form this tableau, she's forming a miniature from a miniature, as it were. So she looks at this little model, and it was quite popular at the time to build these miniature models of alpine scenery or even great Paleolithic monuments, like John Britton's Celtic cabinet or Henry Brown's cork model of Stonehenge. There are all these ideas of taking these ancient monuments of great landscapes and turning them into these miniature scenes. And the reason that one suspects she does this is because by creating this sort of miniature landscape, it's become something that sort of remains uncontaminated by time. You're creating this, as it were, this amazing little world that's completely divorced, as it were, from the rest of the world. So it becomes this extraordinary sanctuary retreat.
And it's almost like a dollhouse, wouldn't you say, in a way?
Yes.
And it's something to be, as you quote Susan Stewart saying, the miniature always tends towards tableau rather than toward narration. So to me, it seems to be this, it's like a little creation on its own, but not necessarily immersive.
Absolutely, it's a sort of a space enthralling. It's sort of self-contained, and I think that someone wrote, an American visitor in the early 19th century, that the illusion was so incredibly strong that it's wonderfully striking and complete. So it really was an amazing thing. And Mrs. Loudon herself said that it was so compelling that even on a hot summer's day, she felt that an alpine chill in the air. So it really did evoke very powerfully this landscape, which we don't even know she ever visited. So it is rather amazing.
So now we're moving on to my favorite subject in the world, topiary. And one of the things that shocked me, Todd, was that you talked about how topiary was quite controversial, and that to basically put an artificial shape on a natural growing tree was anathema to so many people.
Yes, topiary is a very ancient art, probably going back to the ancient Persians and the Romans, etc. And cutting these trees into curious shapes became an English possession, certainly in the 17th century, and it was both purposeful and very inventive and whimsical. And but yes, there was a very strong feeling, certainly in the 18th century, as these things are just beginning to take place, that the marks on the scissors on every plant and bush was considered to be a really terrible thing. And this is everything is conspiring against it, especially in the English landscape garden. But yet these traditions persisted, and these two examples are the work of this wonderful English antiquarian, as well as a clergyman from the Church of England, who so often had time on their hands to do rather amazing things. And he takes 1,000-year-old yew tree and carves it into these extraordinary shapes. And on the left is its original shape, commemorated by a poem to this fellow who did the work. His name was John Saxey. And he was known in his time as Shaver Saxey because he shaved this yew so wonderfully well. And there's a long poesy here that talks about the accomplishments and how it harks back to the ancient world and evokes great antiquity and does all the amazing things you can imagine, proclaiming it has a greater pedigree than the Norma forebearers, etc. So on the right-hand side shows this 100 years later, how it had been transformed, not entirely in the same shape, but how these things can morph over the centuries. It's now sadly gone. I think, in fact, only this year, sadly, it may have been cut down, but it was an extraordinary feat to carve this very ancient tree into something so willfully unnatural, as it were. And if I can move, because I know we've got a few more slides.
I know, with the race along.
I know, so this is the really among the most extraordinary of all, Lord Petersham's garden at Elveston Castle. And he was this great and very idiosyncratic English nobleman from the early 19th century who, shunned by society after he marries a woman who's well below his social caste, decides that he's going to take her up to the country, and he more or less incarcerates her in his amazing castle, which is a rebuilt Gothic castle, and he makes this great chivalric garden. And so she lives in this gilded cage, and he puts together this extraordinary place. You can see here Mon Plaisir, one of the many gardens in there that was created instantly because this man was so ferociously rich. He used all his money moving and buying plants, and he was among the first people in Britain to actually move 300 or 400-year-old trees up to 40 miles from his castle and put them in the garden. And so large were some of the trees when they were being moved and transported and placed in the garden that they were going through his estate villages and actually smashing the windows of the houses on either side of these cottages on either side of the road, so that he could transport his extraordinary things up to the front of his house. And it was compared later, I think even in his own lifetime, to the Villa Palagonia in Sicily, which had this sort of avenue of the monsters or avenue of pandemonium, because he was, again, when he didn't allow anyone into the garden because he was so cross with the fact that everyone was annoyed by his marriage and found his life so unpleasant that he wouldn't allow anyone in. So they formed this great sort of, over years, people do have this romantic ideas what's going on. And it was said that he was the Elgin of topiary, buying up all the topiary peacocks across the whole kingdom. And he made an avenue up to his house, which is complete rubbish. But still, it was this notion, and this became, as it were, what they called the modern Villa Palagonia, with its avenue of monsters up to the front door. And there are a few photographs here that actually show it a little bit later. As you can see in some of these trees, he was keen on monkey puzzles, again, just brought in the 19th century. So quite contemporary.
And interestingly, this photo was taken decades after his death, I believe.
Oh, yeah.
Right? So it was maintained.
Yeah, and it's still, actually, I was through here only a few weeks ago, and it's not so beautiful, but still there, maintained by the local council. So what can you expect?
So Thomas Bland is one of our more modest in terms of social class backgrounds of creators, but nonetheless created something quite marvelous that everybody in the community was able to take advantage of.
He was called, in his time, he was called the worthy yeoman. He was a man of modest means, but unusual gifts and vigorous originality, who decided to create a truly grand garden to great local acclaim. And again, probably like Dame Liza, he may not have traveled abroad. He almost surely didn't travel abroad. So everything he did was created by seeing visible cues elsewhere, so engravings, prints, drawings, paintings, and he makes this really amazing garden. He was a very good draftsman. This is one of his own drawings of his garden. And so it became, as it were, this great receptacle for the display of original and idiosyncratic works of art. But it really is this extraordinary Italianate garden, almost evoking the gardens of ancient Pompeii, in this remote part of Cumbria. And he used to have big parties, what we call Grand Fete, inviting the locals in to celebrate this. And he honored the Queen's birthday, Queen Victoria's birthday. But it really was this amazing place where he did this entirely for the public at his own expense. And what I find so extraordinary too is that in his own drawings, I mean, you can see that there are photographs that show the garden even now, taken a few years ago, and these are full statues, you know, a little bit crude, but still quite interesting. But in his illustrations, he draws them as if they were in a decayed state in a ruined landscape. And so he had this rather beautiful, archaeological, lyrical, melancholic sort of view of his own garden. And all these limbless, headless, fragmentary sculptures really evoke, you know, these wonderful classical landscapes. So it's really fascinating that in the depths of this part of the world, you could do that. And again, someone who had very modest means. And one of the things I do say too in my book is that there were probably many people, or many, but more people who were doing things like this on a modest scale we just don't know about because the papers don't survive. We're very fortunate that this album from which this drawing came only surfaced in the last 5 years. And we do have some of the sculptures, but the landscape is sadly completely gone.
Oh, and the drawings are wonderful. These drawings, I was reminding me, because these are by Bland himself, correct?
They are indeed, exactly. And they're very beautifully drawn. And this is from a man who was a local antiquary. He was self-taught. He really was an extraordinary phenomenon. And he was very much appreciated. But what he's sort of doing is he's sort of bringing these sort of material relics from the Roman. When his interest in antiquity went back to the Romans in Westmoreland when he was living, and he wanted to show this almost continuous civilization all the way up through into that part of what's now called the Pennines, which he compared to the Apennines, as it were, in Italy. So there was a kind of a very interesting joke going on here, but he really was doing a magnificent and very imaginative things in his gardens.
I think we have to speed ahead to the Garden of Eden, if you're okay with that.
Yeah, absolutely.
And what I would say is you all have to buy the book. You have to buy the book and find out about the book too. So this is, I believe, 12 or 17 Albany Street in Bedford. And we are looking at the new Garden of Eden. When I saw this, when you were talking about Mabel Barreltrop, who believed herself to sort of be like a messianic prophetic figure, she and her followers believed that her house was the new Garden of Eden. And I just thought, oh, okay. I was surprised to see how sort of suburban and quotidian it looked.
Yeah, she was local for me because I live in Bedfordshire myself, and she was one of these. She was a figure who emerged from this part of the world, and she was going to bring about great millennial change. And as you say, she was identified as Shiloh, the messenger and daughter of God, whose appearance was foretold by this woman called Joanna Southcott, who was a prophetess who lived in England early in the 18th century. And it was this idea that she was one of these prophets in the line of these Southcottian prophetesses or prophets, and that she was going to bring about this great change to the world. She had 12 apostles and all the other kit that goes with it. And she, again, self-taught, rather a remarkable person, but she decides that she's going to bring about, prepare the world for the second coming of Christ. And she does this from what she considers to be the Garden of Eden. And this is her house in Albany Road, as you say, in central Bedfordshire. And it is a pretty boring, rather typical sort of house of the period. And it's hard to believe that this was in fact the Garden of Eden, or as they say, the land of Goshen, so the place of plenty and comfort. But this was her vision of the world, and it was an extraordinary thing to have done. And she preyed on. She decided that it was a very good thing to, as it were, invite women from, largely widows from the community, who were very rich, to partake of the place and just to join her community. And they brought a lot of money, and in the course of that, they actually bought a lot of land around central Bedfordshire, and they formed this place, the Estate of Jerusalem, as they called it, in central Bedfordshire. And the garden played a pivotal role in this idea of as it were, creating this place, the Garden of Eden, that was going to be the welcoming place for the Lord. So they had this idea that what was going to happen was that you can imagine that Christ would one day arrive and sort of knock on the gate and come in, and he'd be welcomed into the garden. And they spent their lives rehearsing for this great moment. And Mabel Baltrop, or known as Octavia, was a very good person to prepare them for all these things. Here you see them dancing around the Yggdrasil tree, which is this wonderful weeping ash beside the chapel. And it's the ash tree of existence in Norse mythology. And so it's a pagan symbol in a largely Christian community, but there we go, it's England. And but there were a few men who lived in the community were rehearsing, as it were, for the imminent arrival of Jesus. So they were preparing the dances. They were taught how to eat sandwiches and how to have wonderful behavior when this moment occurs. And the landscape, as you mentioned, of God, was pretty benign, pretty boring in a way. And that's because it was really based on, Mabel was not, although she was a great visionary, she didn't have, I don't think, huge aesthetic knowledge or interests. And she really based it on what she knew, and it was the Edwardian town garden. So the garden is very English for the period and very unremarkable. But in that way, it's entirely eccentric. Because if you consider when you're making the Garden of Eden, how many inspirational sources there must be, she goes to the most tedious, rather, the most commonplace kind of level, and chooses, as it were, this as the basis for her place. So it really is rather extraordinary that this should be, in fact, the Garden of Eden. And yep, there we go. It's
my favorite part of the story is how she has a friend who's a follower for a time, whose garden backs on to this Garden of Eden. And so they open up the wall and they extend the space. And then the friend gets married and leaves, and they wall it back up. And that Mabel, or Octavia, as she's known, sees it as the fall, which this of huge proportions, the walling up of the garden and not having that anymore.
Everything was based on sort of almost a biblical, her biblical imagination, and so that was very fervent. She was very fervent in beliefs about all these things, and this animated the landscape. But but the rest of the garden was incredibly conventional, as you say. And she tried to expand her empire. She created this thing called the Royal Domain, and it expanded up to 12 miles. And my house, where I'm sitting now, lies within the Royal Domain, which means that we're protected from the devil, as it were. So she wanted to expand her universe larger and larger. Sadly, she died. One of the things she promised her community when they joined was eternal life. And she was among the first to pass away. And it didn't, strangely, dissuade her followers from carrying the flag. They kept on, the society only sort of disbanded entirely in the 21st century. So must have been.
Todd, we have 15 seconds until we go to questions.
This is the last one I want to end on here. So if I could, and I just want to end on this particular slide because Squire Walton's a rather amazing man. He was a proto-conservationist, and he traveled in South America very early in his days, and these are these supposed beasts he met along his travels. And one of them was a caiman. Here he is riding a caiman. He was considered to be Britain's first eco-warrior. He starts this amazing thing. And what this is that you can see here is that you get him in the landscape of his house, Walton Hall. And it really it shows to me this wildly inventive man who's doing this extraordinary place, creating a sanctuary for wild animals that were very undesirable at the time. So all the vermin that lived in Britain at the time were walled into this place, in this industrial land. Outside was very industrialized. He wants to create a sanctuary or haven, and he makes this place. And Edith Sitwell, to end again on Edith Sitwell, she says very nicely, she says that his experience was such mischievous and the product of such a quirky and lively imagination she sort of said that he possessed an irrepressible sense of fun. His was a very agreeable kind of eccentricity. It was eccentric to be childlike, but never childish. We might multiply instances of his eccentricity to any extent, and we may safely say that the world would be a much better place than it is now if such eccentricity were more common. So it seems a very nice place to stop.
Well, we have a few questions for you. The first question is, did your research include the people who would have done the physical labor to implement the artificial landscapes when not the owner/designer?
Sometimes that information survives, but not always, because the records don't survive. But we know from Dame Liza that she's working with her gardener, and also we know that Sir Charles Isham was building with his gardeners and labourers. So they're not always named by name, but some of them were. And also it should be said that going through the wills of some of these people after they died, they were very generous in their bequests to their gardeners and labourers on the estate, and that's when people had them. I mean, some of them, like Thomas Bland's, making his own things anyways. But these were collaborations. But when one doesn't know enough always about the other people who are actually doing the physical work. But I'm interested here first in, as it were, coming to grips with what the ultimate expression is. But there's no doubt that one could hardly expect people to make any of these compositions entirely on his or her own. They require other people to help them on their way.
And to sort of continue that thought, you explicitly say at the beginning that you aren't going to discuss what happens to the gardens after the demise of the owner, but you do have at the very end a list of the current state of each garden, which is very interesting, sort of a postscript if people are curious.
It's true, and it's sad because you realize that so many were destroyed or lined with motorways or other things like that. So it's a poignant reminder that gardens are ephemeral creations, and that's this kind of evanescence of gardens that makes them so remarkably interesting. And at least we have records of these. And as I said from the beginning, there are possibly many more instances of eccentric gardeners operating in the period I'm examining, but sadly these records don't come down to us. But when they do, they are pretty powerful reminders of how people could be wildly imaginative in the confines of these small spaces, and how some people had the courage to actually express themselves physically through their environments that they were very closely associated with, and how it was something that they really felt they had to do in their own lifetime, and very unselfconsciously, and then just let these things disappear. I mean, and that's possibly why some of these things don't survive either, because people weren't trying to record them. They were very happy to keep them as things, living, dynamic organisms during the course of their own lives, rather than designing. They weren't designing as great palaces, things for posterity.
Oh, and Todd, I mean, you're giving me chills right now, because so many people today live through looking at things through their camera. Like, it doesn't exist if it isn't filmed, if it isn't recorded for others to look at. And I think that you were saying to me before today that that's one of the reasons you sort of stopped your figures around 1920, 1930, because there becomes a bit of a self-consciousness, an awareness of being documented and doing it for other people's eyes.
Yes, and people become, it's become fashionable, to be considered eccentric. And I deliberately didn't want to deal with that. It's rather too complex. I also didn't want people who were alive saying, I'm eccentric, how come I'm not in your book? But it's true that it's much more self-conscious now, and that insofar as there's not a reproach, as it were, to be called eccentric anymore, it hasn't got quite the same cachet, and it doesn't mean the same to me either. So I think that in going through all these gardens, there are, as I said already, I've talked about these various themes and strands that run through them, but it's basically people who are just creating these extraordinary fantasy lands, and a lot of them have a very paradisal aspect to them. And as I said, they kind of take them either to the past, the future, or a time which we don't even know. But they're very, in a way, even the ones that are very much on public display, they're still intensely personalized and can be read on different levels, but ultimately are a wonderful and extraordinary autobiography of these various constructors.
Todd, we have another question, and I'm dying. I don't even know how you're going to answer it. But Eileen Hogan wanted to know, do you have a favorite garden or person amongst this passionate, idiosyncratic cast of characters?
I'm very, very fond of Dame Eliza Broughton. I must say, I think she's someone who really appeals to me. I've always been partial to mountainous landscapes. I really love her idea of creating this very, very convincing and rather extraordinary cordillera around her garden, and with all its madness of sort of placing, let's say, where polite flower gardens beside camellia house beside things. There's so many different influences. And there's another woman who I didn't discuss too, called Jane Hill, who was creating a garden. If I can just go back to show you an image here, since we're there. This is this wonderful landscape in West Country of England. And she was creating this garden with her family where there was terrific grandeur and terror, these wonderful and wild scenes of irregularity. And she makes, with her family, they introduce all these exotic sort of things, features within the landscape, including Tahitian huts and a Swiss cottage and other things. And this is this wonderful mouldering ruin called the Giant's Well, which is a huge abyss covered with the remains of what was considered to be a giant's castle. And she sits in the background of this very quietly. Her family gets, her brothers and her father get all the credit for doing this, but I'm quite certain that we know she took Samuel Johnson and Mrs. Thrale, Mrs. Piozzi around the gardens. They said how remarkable she was and how much she knew. But I think she also mythologized this garden in a really interesting way. She made up these characters, I believe, of Tarquin, Tarquinius, these huge giants from ancient Rome who inhabited these ruins. And she really brought to life in a very extraordinary way, writing this fantastic narrative, which gives another level to the gardens, and yet she's completely in the shadows. And so she's another person whom I'd really love to have met, because I think that, as Mrs. Piozzi said, that she was very, although this woman looked as common as a housemaid, she said, and looked very dreary, she was the most wonderful person to speak to. And she said she'd be very sad to leave her company and really hope that she might have more time to converse with her. I feel the same. And it just, I suppose, again, the nice thing about this is the contrast between the person, him or herself, and the landscape. Because very often, very extraordinary people did not create great gardens. I mean, people who might be outwardly very showy may have had rather dreary places. And the most wonderful thing that you can find is someone like this who's very self-effacing, she was a fervent Christian, among other things, and yet you have this extraordinary picturesque landscape. There's a great paradox in the way that people present themselves on the surface and express themselves in their gardens. And I think this is one of the great wonders of gardening, that you can have that kind of double life, as it were.
Todd, we are doing one more question. And I think it speaks to, the title includes English garden, or the two words English garden in the title, but you explicitly say in the introduction that this isn't about being English. So our question is, so think about that. And then the question is, it appears many of these gardens are examples of colonial curation and exoticism. Were there cases of eccentric English gardens that focus primarily on English flora/fauna?
Yes, and the one that I will point out, this one here, which is, although this is made out of the rocks of Gibraltar, it was among the earliest rock gardens where they grew indigenous plants. So there is, and in fact, many of these gardens, and I didn't have time to talk about these things, but many of these gardens do have indigenous aspects. And that's the thing that's so fascinating, is that the exotic coexists with the very humdrum and more indigenous sort of landscape. Waterton himself too was, as I haven't had a chance to say, but his whole life was spent growing ivy and native trees and things, and really resuscitating the English landscape in a more natural way. And his colleagues were considered him to be a heretic in a way, because he was making habitat for vermin like sparrows and martins and other things like that. And really, but he was now what we now call sort of, a conservationist. And he was really concerned in creating habitat and natural things for animals. So yes, there was a great deal of a marriage. And I think one of the strengths and interests of lots of English gardens in general is the fact that we don't always, although we do introduce exotic elements to the landscape, that there's always a degree, and there's a lot of components that are still very native to our own exotic isle, and we mix those with impunity. And I think that's what makes these gardens rather more curious than maybe you do get in some of the places on the continent, because we can introduce that exoticism as well as have the other stuff coexist. And I think that makes for a very rich mixture.
Todd, I hope you don't mind my saying this, but I found the book eminently readable. It was almost a cozy experience, even though it's chock full of, insights and information and important history. But it's really something you want to read, and it's perfect for having on your nightstand and just dipping into one chapter at a time. If one biography at a time. I think it's also a book, because I've reread it a few times. I always get something new every time I go back and read about it. There's so many facets to personality and passion, the design, the experience. What is a garden supposed to be? It's so thoughtful, but yet, and I say yet enjoyable. It's just a pure pleasure, this book. So thank you for writing it, and thank you for your time exploring it with us today.
Thank you so much. And I hope it encourages anyone who reads it to become slightly more eccentric.
Indeed. Okay, well, thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.